When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. We're so happy to have you join us for this book review today, and we're very happy that our good friend, Leslie Ross-Degnan, is here again to kind of guide us through the book that we're looking at. The name is The Journals of May Sarton at 70. Leslie is a published poet, and she's a writer, and she's loves children's books, and just a really good friend. So welcome, Leslie. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Gregg. It's nice to be here again. We are reading something different today. It's a journal. I've never read a journal before by May Sarton about turning 70. Thought it would be an interesting topic for our oldish population. Sarton was a prolific writer. Way into her later years, she wrote 53 books, including 15 novels, 17 collections of poetry, 15 nonfiction, such as memoirs and journals, and 3 children's books. Her friends and her critics consider her journals and memoirs to be among her best and most enduring works. And I'm not really that familiar with reading journals. I've done some of my own personal journaling, but I haven't read the journals of others. I found it to be deeply personal. I felt like sometimes I was reading something that wasn't meant for me, but for the most part, a lot of it was just a simple account of Sarton's day-to-day life and her feelings about it. She says about journaling that the job of journaling is to record a mood as it comes exactly as possible, knowing that life in its flux and the mood is sure to change. She wrote a lot of journals. If you're interested, just go online and find them. She's got one called The Journal of Solitude, one of her most famous, one called Recovering, about her long-term relationship ending and her dealing with breast cancer, another, The House by the Sea, when she moved to York, Maine after the stroke. Most of her novels were written in her 60s, 70s, and 80s. So in this journal at 70, she deals with a lot of issues of aging. She also writes about friendships, her self-doubt as a writer, and her success as a writer. And her deep love of nature is another really important theme in this journal, as well as her struggles with the loneliness of leading a creative life. You'll see that in a lot of her journals. Obviously, the Journal of a Solitude was a lot about it. These are common themes in Sarton's novels. One of the obvious reasons that I chose this journal for discussion is because it's about turning 70, and I just had my 70th birthday this year. It felt like a big deal. I mean, bigger than I expected. And so I was really, it gave me an opportunity actually to learn a few things from somebody else who had just turned 70. In this journal, I thought I'd get more biographical information, reflections on the past, true confessions, kind of a straight from the horse's mouth kind of thing. But mostly, as I said before, it was real life happening in real time. Random thoughts, chores she needed to do, working in her garden, walking her dog, her little Sheltie Tomas, having lunch with friends, and really just the normal flow of life. And I kind of got used to that flow after a while. reading this novel. How did you all feel about that? It was a different format.
It took me a while to get used to it because, as you said, it did feel like kind of felt like reading my sister's diary. There were times when I'm like, should I know this? And what if she catches me in her room reading her diary? That sort of silly thing. But the short pieces that ranged from deep reflection to the sun is shining, I found really interesting. And I found it interesting to see her feeling change day to day. And you could really get a sense of her moodiness, her tiredness, and sometimes her feelings about getting old were definitely up and down as she went along. And there were not very many journal entries at all in here that did not involve her garden. She was an avid gardener and talked a lot about what she's planting, what's overgrown, what's beautiful, people coming to help her with her garden and so on. And I found that just a great metaphor for what was going on inside of her.
I agree. The garden was a metaphor. And I did have this one quote that I found really beautiful about the garden. She says, the garden, quote, is always a series of losses set against a few triumphs, like life itself. And we see this throughout her journal as she works so hard to create beauty in her garden. And it is a real metaphor about life. Things are up and down. Some things go good and some things don't go so well in her garden.
Yeah.
She takes away. She's persistent. Yeah, I find myself wanting to read more of her work. I mean, from her journals, even though it was just a lot of it was so day to day-ish, I felt like, well, I suppose that's the point, a selling point, because, fans of her books get to know the real person behind the writing, and new readers who haven't read her before become more interested in learning about her and maybe reading more of her books. I found myself after reading this journal, going into reading more of her poetry. And I actually did read another book. I read Mrs. Stevens' Here's the Mermaid Singing. So it was motivating in that way.
It also captures the essence of life in the sense of the theme in life of impermanence. And that is so captured by gardening and all that she wrote about gardening. And I also wanted to say that as I was reading and kept the theme of gardening kept coming up, it made me think of a book we have reviewed in the past together called Remnant Population, and how the main character in that book did a lot of gardening, a lot. And in that context, she was gardening for survival. She was gardening and growing food. But it just made me wonder, since it was such a big theme in that book, or I thought it was, and certainly a big theme in this book, and I think the metaphor in this book of gardening seemed a little bit more out there. And Remnant Population, I wonder if that was something that author was trying to symbolize. So, impermanence.
Yeah. And as Greg mentioned, there are a lot of aging issues she writes about in the oldish part of this journal. And I mean, right from the very beginning, someone asks her she sends someone asks her in the journal, what does it feel like to be 70? And here's a few quotes I pulled out of the book. In the first one, she's written this over and over again in several of her journals. She says, I'm more myself now than I've ever been at 70. Janet, you're shaking your head.
Yes. Yeah, I found that interesting. It goes along with a quote I wrote down where she said, we had all managed to become our true selves. And my thought when I read that was, is this the goal of life and specifically of aging? Is that our goal, is to become our true selves? And is there a sense when we become oldish that hopefully we can say, yeah, I am on that path and I'm far along on that path at this point of finding my true self.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah.
I want to read a quote too. As long as you guys are reading quotes, I'm reading a quote too. This is one that I thought was kind of quintessentially oldish. It's at the end of a journal entry, and it's on Monday, May 17th. Each one of the journal entries has the day's date on it. I realize that 70 must seem extremely old to my young friends, but I actually feel much younger than I did when I wrote The House by the Sea 6 years ago, and younger than I did in Nelson when I wrote the poem Gestalt at 60. Those previews of old age were not entirely accurate, I am discovering, and that, as far as I can see, is because I live more completely in the moment these days, am not as anxious about the future, and am far more detached from the areas of pain, the loss of love, the struggle to get the work completed, the fear of death. I have less guilt because there is less anger. Perhaps before I die, I shall make peace with my father and be able to heal the wound that Leonard's book has forced me to think about again. So there you go. That's oldishness in a nutshell right there.
Yep. No regret.
Yeah.
Move on. Yeah, I think that's really true. And then she said this little quick one, and I wonder what she means by this. She says, the person still on her way. Real old age begins when one looks backward instead of forward. I'm not sure what she means by that.
I think, again, that's what we've been saying about oldish the whole time, is that if you're oldish, you're still looking forward. And one of the signs of being old is that you're not. You're not looking forward to what you're going to do in 5 years. You're looking backward to what you did 15 years ago. One of the things that I liked about this book was that you turn the page and there's oldishness again.
Yeah, it's true. It's right throughout.
One of my reactions as a psychologist is that it's both. I think that it's imperative that we make peace at this point in our lives with our past. And the only way we can do that is look back at it. And I think, what you just said, Greg, about her looking forward is what the theme of what we're trying to do with this podcast. So I would say be able to bring both in the sense of what, making peace and healing, like she says, about wanting to heal from her pain from her father. One of the things that I liked about her writing is about being oldish and aging is that she waffled. Sometimes she talked about, I'm just in the present, and that's what I've realized, that getting older is just being in the moment. And then she would talk about, I'm really thinking about what's coming next and when should I move into an assisted living place. And so she talked about just feeling that she's come home to her true self. And then other times she would say she doesn't always feel that way. So I like that. It's like giving us permission to be in this almost chaos of life.
Yeah, she takes a lot of poetic license in her description of aging and getting older and the benefits and the disadvantages as well. So she eventually kind of just paints a whole clear picture of what it means to her in the end. She talks about how incredible it feels to be 70. And then she said, and this was my question. I'm wondering, she says, one often fears what's ahead. And then when one gets there, it's not at all as one feared. These days, 70 is not old, especially if good health is in the cards. So, this was in the 80s that she said this, right? And I'm thinking, okay, I felt encouraged by that. So 70 is not old. Is it oldish?
Yes. It's almost like we hired her to write this book for our podcast.
I wish we could have her on the show.
Thank you, May Sarton. We appreciate that.
I can see the three of us on the screen that we're using for the recording on this Zoom-like screen. There's a gap. There's a place there for May Sarton. It would be fun to look at her and get her take on all of this. She'd probably think we're silly.
She wrote a journal about being 70, so she probably, I don't know, thinks that we're silly. She's silly, but
no, I'm sure she's here.
No,
do you think she's here? There she is, Greg. You can just see her, and she says things like, getting joys and my joy in life has nothing to do with being old. It has everything to do with simply watching the sun shine through the petals of a flower. This is her poetic person, noticing the way that the sea looks at dawn or seeing a goldfinch dart through the trees. I mean, that's peace. Yeah, I think. Very nice.
Yes, peace and contentment. And I feel like she just captured this aging process. I was writing some of my notes included. First, one quote was what I said about we had all managed to become our true selves. Another few days later, she's talking about the struggle of aloneness. And I wonder, I'd be able to sit and watch the flowers, the birds, and her garden growing, how much of that being in the moment is enhanced as we age.
Well, as
if
she
we're
says,
open to it.
she's not spending as much time worrying about stuff. And
Yeah.
so if worry is very noisy. So if you're not worrying and you don't have all of that racket going on inside of your head, then maybe you can listen more closely to the world.
Yes.
Well, also, she spends a lot of time alone. I mean, she didn't have a family. She wasn't partnered in her old age either. She didn't have children. She didn't even have any siblings, but she was close to both her parents. She had a rich family life, I think, growing up. And she often mentions her parents in her journal. And on August 31st, one of her entries was about her father because it was his birthday. And she writes about him and notes that she's close to his age when he died, which is kind of an interesting place that I often find myself. I think about my mother was almost 80 when she died, and I think about that. And on her mother's birthday, which was also in August 3rd, she also recalled fond memories. She even wrote a poem. It's not a long one. I'm going to read it. It's called August 3rd, which is her mother's birthday. She says, "These days, lifting myself up like a heavy weight, old camel getting to her knees, I think of my mother and the inexhaustible flame that kept her alive until she died. She knew all about fatigue and how one pushes it aside for staking up the lilies early in the morning, the way one pushes it aside for a friend in need, for a hungry cat. Mother, be with me today on your birthday. I am older than you were when you died 35 years ago. Thinking of you, the old camel gets to her knees, stands up, moves slowly forward into the new day. If you taught me one thing, it was never to fail life." Beautiful.
It is beautiful.
She's a good poet. I really enjoyed her poetry. So, I mean, do you find yourself thinking about your parents as you get closer to the age they were when they died? My father's 98. He's still alive. Mother was 80 when she died. But I'm not quite there yet.
I think about that a little bit. In the intro to our podcast, I talk about my father was just about 90 when he passed away, and I'm 73. So I think about those 17 years left to go. I also think about my mother a lot, and that same thing. She was 80 when she died, but the last few years, she didn't remember who she was. In some ways, I think, well, maybe she lived to be in her mid-70s. Then after that, she wasn't somebody else, but she couldn't remember who she was. So I do think about that sometimes. And I think about the question at the beginning of the podcast is, what am I going to do for the next 30 years? It seems like a long chunk. Even my father, 17 more years, I got no idea. I barely remember what I did last year. And so to think of 17 more years without a plan, that ought to be interesting. I do know a lot of people. One person in particular she turned 79. She turned 79 last summer, and she celebrated on the pickleball court. And everybody it's like, oh, this is great. You're 79 years old. And she said, yeah, and I'm so happy because both of my parents died when they were 78. And I've lived 1 year longer than they did. And I was afraid that I wasn't going to. So, and that's not the first time somebody said that to me. I've seen a lot of people, when they get past the age at which one or more of their parents died, there's almost like a sigh of relief.
Or older siblings even. Yeah, that's true. And Sarton didn't, like I said, she didn't have family. And I think as you age, family becomes more important even. I certainly feel that way about my family, my extended family and friends as well. And Sarton, on her 70th Christmas, she is reminiscing about holidays and her parents and her partner, of 13 years, Judith Matlaw. she's rarely mentioned in this journal, but during the holidays, Sarton gets a call from her nephew, Tim. They were no longer together, and I'll get to why in a minute. But she gets a call from Judith's nephew that Judy had died, and she suffered from Alzheimer's. You mentioned something great about somebody not remembering who they were. And I think that, this Alzheimer's disease is sort of what separates people. It's very difficult in a relationship to stay together with a person with Alzheimer's. And she suffered for years from the disease. And she writes about being released from that emotional limbo around her partner Judy's illness, because this is not uncommon for Alzheimer's, because people are there, right? But they're not there. They're alive, but they're not really there. And she felt now that when she heard of her death, that she could properly grieve the loss of her dear friend. And Judith was not even 70 when her Alzheimer's started, and she was moved into a nursing home because she didn't have a family either. And then when Sarton had her house in York, Maine, she visited her in the nursing home often, but when she had her house, Judith spent lots of time there and several days at a time. And Sarton said some sort of bittersweet things, that their visits were difficult because she says, and this is a quote, that the familiar warmth between them was haunted by Judy's fading mind. Now, that's an interesting way to put it. Like, they still loved each other. They couldn't, it was one way because the other person wasn't able to express it because of Alzheimer's disease. And sadly, Sarton was only 30. Well, when she met Judith, she was 33. And Judith was 12 years older than her, so she was quite a bit older. So she was probably going to precede her anyway. But when they separated about 13 years later, they stayed friends and family to each other. If you're interested in more about their relationship, the best parts of their relationship, you can read it in Matlock's collection of poetry titled Honey in the Hive. Honey in the Hive is probably the only. Judith Matlock was also a writer, but Sarton definitely did outshine her. She was the big, accomplished writer in the relationship. And I think that's always difficult when two creatives are living together. Writers, particularly. She did write this beautiful collection of poetry, though, so it would be worth looking at. Honey in the Hive by Judith Matlock. And I think friends, as we said, are also really important in our relationships as we grow older, especially our peers, people that are our own age.
Absolutely. And one thing I noticed was that she touched on themes that we all deal with, process. Near the beginning of the book, she was talking about, she said she ever making sense of her parents. And a page later, she was saying that she's making meaning of the past, and especially friendship, or including friendships. So I noticed that, and I just thought that we continue to make sense of these really important relationships and experiences in our life. And again, hopefully finding our true selves, finding that meaning making.
Yeah, Sarton had a lot of friends, and some of them were famous, but I don't want to get into it. She had a lot of friends that were writers and artists and actors and very accomplished, creative people were her good friends. Mm-hmm. And she writes, at 70, I have May friends. My address book has 1,000 names in it. I write to every one of my friends at least once a year, and often more. And I'm thinking, and this was before email.
Exactly.
She spent hours, corresponding with her friends who were all over the world. She went to Europe like every year or something. So she had friends literally all over the world. Yeah. And in her journal, I noticed she always seemed to be catching up with her correspondent. She had tons and tons of fan mail, not just her friends, but she had lots and lots of fan mail. And she was really good to her fans. I don't think she handled criticism very well. I got from some things that I read, really threw her for a loop. And I think she was not treated fairly in terms of how prolific she was as a writer and how beautiful her poetry was. I don't think she got the recognition maybe that she deserved. And I'm not sure. I wonder sometimes if it's because she was a lesbian, because it was not, there was something going on there in terms of her getting the attention that she deserved as a writer. And she did emphasize in her journals that she didn't see herself as a, quote, lesbian writer. I think it was because of the times. She didn't want to limit her work by what she called her sexual proclivity. And in some ways, that was survival back then. She wanted to write universally on what human love is all about. And she was worried that if she wrote openly about being a lesbian, that it would overshadow all her other writing. So I think it took a lot of courage for her to write Mrs. Stephen Here's the Mermaid Singing, because that's really it. Did either of you read any of that?
No.
Yeah, because really it was overtly a novel about gay and lesbian relationships. The main character was in love with her nanny, but she continued to realize that she did love women. She was attracted to women, even though later, because of social mores, this main character married a man. She still had relationships with women. And there was also a part of the novel where she met a young man who was attracted to men. And he struggled with this attraction. He thought it was terrible that he was attracted to men. He was ashamed of it, and he didn't want to be attracted to men, but he couldn't help it. But he was able to talk to her about it. And it wasn't socially acceptable for her. But Mrs. Stevens tried to assure him that it was, and this is a quote, and I thought this was a pretty powerful quote about being gay or lesbian. She said, "It's not in any way repulsive, pitiable, or disgusting as society would think." And that was a strong statement. And after this book was released, it was released in 1965, when women were enjoying a lot more freedom and equality, the book became very popular in women's studies classes at universities and colleges, and was being embraced by feminists and lesbians as a work of art to read, a book about differences. It was really interesting.
The one thing that she wrote about that I wondered what your response was, she said, the fact that I feel so young, but am old.
Yeah, that was interesting because she also talked about being a woman who's an old woman that doesn't have wrinkles on her face is really odd. Something like doesn't fit. No, I think she's talking about accepting the process of aging, that it's a process. It's going to happen to us all. And
what do you both feel about that as far as feelings? Do you feel that way sometimes? The fact that I feel so young but am old?
Oh, absolutely. I do. Do you, Greg?
Yeah, pretty much every day. Inside, although I think a bit differently and I understand things in a different way than I did when I was younger, I don't feel, in terms of springiness, I suppose, inside, I don't feel any different as far as I can recall from when I was younger. Certainly the inside of my head, the wrinkliness of it doesn't match the wrinkliness of my face. When I think about sitting down or standing up, I don't grunt the way that I do when I sit down or stand up. So I often wonder, what was it like to be able to stand up without making that noise?
Is that discouraging to you, or is it, because that sentence that she wrote, I wonder what is behind that for her. Is it just a statement? Is there a lot of feeling under that?
Well, I remember my mother saying, I feel the same way I did when I was 20. She said, but when I look in the mirror, I know I'm not 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, I relate to that. It's like your inner and your outer world, like they don't jive. Like my hair is white, but it's still thick and shiny and it doesn't feel old, but it is.
Yes.
And also my in body physically, like you saw Greg grunting when you get up. It's also one thing I notice too is that if I don't keep doing what I'm doing, I can't keep doing what I want to do.
Exactly.
If I don't keep moving, like I'm just getting over a cold. So I've been very, haven't been moving around a lot. I haven't been swimming. I haven't been doing the physical things I enjoy. I've hardly been walking because it's been so cold. So then when I start to do that again, my legs are sore. Like what?
Emma Children, that we've talked about a lot on the podcast, has a great line in one of her teachings in which she says she's not afraid of mirrors. She understands that she looks older than she did, but she goes on to say, But sometimes in the morning, I'll catch a look in the mirror and I'll say, who is that? And I definitely relate to that feeling. It's like, who is that? Where'd that young guy go? Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't regret it most of the time, but I'm certainly aware of it. I'm pleased that I'm able to do the stuff that I'm able to do. You know, we talk about pickleball a lot, and this morning I went snowshoeing, and yesterday I was out cross country skiing. And when it gets to be spring, with any luck, I'll be on my bicycle again, and I go for walks. And someone that I used to play pickleball with had a line that was, motion is lotion. If you keep moving, you can keep moving. The loosens up the joints and so on. And I'm very aware of that. But I'm also very pleased in my oldishness that I'm not limited by it. I don't let it limit me, maybe is a way to express that. So I get up in the morning and say, I'm going to go get some exercise today. I'm going to go play. But I'm definitely aware of getting older, except as I said, internally, I don't. You know, maybe I've learned a thing or two over the years, but I doubt it. But inside, I feel just as young as I ever did. Where maybe it's not just as young, but maybe internally is ageless. You know, so my heart is ageless. I'll go with that.
And that might go along with something that May Sarton wrote near the end of her book, where she said, this year of being 70 is coming back to deep roots in childhood and seeing how little I've changed regarding essential things.
Yes.
hmm.
Yeah, I'd go with that one. I think that the maintenance of innocence, the essential things that she's talking about. What I heard was, the innocence. And there was a book years ago. I learned everything I needed to know about in kindergarten. Play well with others and be kind and clean up your mess, that sort of thing. So the maintenance of that innocence, I think, is probably important as we get older. Maintenance or reconnecting. You know, a lot of the intervening years were spent grasping. And now that those grasping years are over, maybe it helps to be retired. Also, an important thing to note is that May Sarton was not retired when she wrote this. She still had several more books to go. So she wasn't writing in her retirement. She was writing in her creative years, which continued. She started being creative in her 20s and continued really right up until the end. A further on turning 80, she did it again.
Yeah, that's really true. She was really hardworking. When she was asked, how do you keep up on your writing as an older woman? She said, writing for me is a way of understanding, of thinking things out, and born out of a question I need to answer. Perhaps it's a need to make order out of chaos over and over again. And I think that her writing was, she had a very rich eternal dialogue. I think she was really a very solitary person, a real introvert. And she had a lot of good social skills because she had to, and she was trained in that way really through the theater, I think, because she really didn't, she was well educated. She had a scholarship to Vassar, but she didn't want to finish college. She was attracted to she joined the repertory theater in New York, and she learned a whole lot about acting and reading and in front of people. And I think it really developed her personality. I think probably took her out of her introverted, only child kind of personality that she had. I think that she had a very rich inner life. She says solitude's her element. That here's what she says about solitude, which is interesting, which makes me think this was a real introverted person. Extreme awareness of other people precludes awareness of oneself. So after a while, the self no longer knows it exists. And as a writer, I'm only really myself when I'm creating. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So I wanted to just say, you mentioned innocence, that I thought there was an innocence to the tone of the journal. It was very poetic and contemplative, but I think it was also a little guarded and self-conscious. Some of it, I don't know if you got that feeling, but as far as this journal, in closing, I just want to say that it was not only a reflection on aging, but at 70, it was an opportunity for Sarton, I think, to reassure herself that she's still who she thinks she is. She's a poet. She's a novelist. She's a person rich in friendships, gardener, a pet lover. All these things were emphasized in her journal. An ocean gazer, an overall kind-hearted, hard-working New Englander. It's like she was preparing to write her own epitaph with this journal. She realized May Sarton, who did all these amazing things in her life at 70 years of age, which is remarkable. And I was thinking maybe we should all think about starting a journal in our 70th year and use it as a way to reflect on where we are in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great idea. You've given us a challenge. Great idea. It's a great challenge. Leslie.
Yes, we need a challenge like that, because I was thinking when I was reading it that maybe this year I'll actually do it. I think pretty steadily, and certainly every January 1st, as far back as I can remember, my list of resolutions included writing a journal. But I don't think I ever got further than a week or two. And one of the things that struck me about her journal, as opposed to one of the reasons that I didn't keep writing the journals, is I couldn't get it out of my head that somebody else was going to read it. And so I never got around to getting the right voice. And it never occurred to me to use my own voice. So maybe I'll do a journal by talking, but it never occurred to me to use my own voice. But May Sarton's voice in her journal, to me, is clearly the voice of someone who knows for sure that other people are going to be reading it.
She's a writer. You have to assume lots of people are going to read it. I would like to, if I may, I'd like to close this with a poem. One of Sarton's poem called New Year Resolve. The time has come to stop allowing the clutter to clutter my mind like dirty snow. Shove it off and find clear time, clear water. Time for a change. Let silence in like a cat who has sat at my door, neither wild nor strange, hoping for food from my store and shivering on the mat. Let silence in. She will rarely speak or mew. She will sleep on my bed, and all I have ever been, either false or true, will live again in my head. For it is now, or not, as old age stilts the stream, to shove away the clutter, to untie every knot, to take the time to dream, to come back to still water.
Thank you, May.
Thank you, May. Thank you, May. And thank you to Leslie and Greg for this lovely delving into oldishness.
I feel
with
like
the
we
help
were
of
just
May
sitting
Sarton.
around in her garden by the sea having a cup of tea. And so it's been nice hanging out with you folks and with May
Yes.
Sarton and this delicious cup of probably chamomile tea.
Lovely.
Lovely. We will meet again at another book.
Yes. I look forward
shortly.
to that.
Yes, me too.
Why?
Bye, everybody. Bye, Janet.
Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
Leslie. That's it for now. Thanks to our friend Leslie Ross-Degnan for joining us again to discuss this fascinating book. Thanks for listening. We really enjoyed this conversation and hope you did too. Please go to www.oldish.me to leave a comment about how this conversation about May Sarton's at 70 may have stimulated your thinking about aging and oldishness. We'd really like to have you join us. Know someone we should talk with? Let us know via email, voicemail, or a comment.